All right. Okay, we're actually going to do some coding here. First thing to think about whenever you start diving into building a script is two things. A, think your way through it. Think your way through it. The block editor is, like I said, it's just a translation system, right? It's going to take the thoughts in your head and turn them into action on the screen. You've got to write this out, and you'll write it out in English probably, or another language, no offense. I'm using it in English, but you'll write it out using your language, and then the block controller will translate it into the language of Lua. Well, that might mean it could be really helpful for you to start off by writing it out in your own language. I'm going to go to the System tab and grab this comment block. This block here is a block that is completely ignored by the Lua engine. Completely ignored. This will do nothing in your design of any kind whatsoever. But it's useful for you because you can write out what you're doing more descriptively and more friendly so that you can understand what your blocks are doing, and it works for the next person looking at your design, right? The next engineer who's got to look at your file, they can read that comment and have more comfort in knowing what it is you're trying to accomplish. So let's use our comment blocks to talk through what our navigation buttons are going to do. So first of all, let's think this through. I got 3 navigation buttons. When the first button is pressed, I want to make sure that the other buttons turn off, and I want the layers on the UCI to show the proper layer, right? Let's literally write that down. So when the nav1 button is pressed, that's one chunk of an activity that could happen. I'm going to copy and paste this, and I'll make another comment block. Let's see. Nav1 UCI layer should appear. We want that to happen. What else do we want to have happen? We want nav2 and 3 UCI layers should disappear. Okay. And we want the other nav buttons to turn off. So, and the navigation buttons should turn on or off appropriately, right? So that means the nav1 should stay on, nav2 and 3 should be off. We got 4 lists of things that we need to accomplish now with blocks. All right, we've got our marching orders. Essentially, we know what we have to do. Let's do it. So, first thing we're going to do is we're going to use the event handler block. I mentioned this. Go to your controls tab, go down to nav1 room. These are all the things associated with that particular control. A lot of them just have to do with changing the state of the control. It could be turning the control on, turning the control off, changing its color, adjusting it in some way. But at the very top is the most useful one. This is our event handler block for this control. When this control is pressed, it will do a thing. And you can see it's got that wide alligator mouth that I was describing. Let's grab that out of here. And in fact, we're going to just kind of snap our entire list of commands right inside of its mouth. When you connect these blocks together, by the way, it's always worth noting, when you connect them together, that means that it's always going to run them through in that order. When they are snapped together, it automatically does line 1, and then line 2, and then line 3, and then line 4. In fact, let's take a quick sidebar and look at this in the Lua side really quickly. I mentioned earlier that you can use this editor to read Lua as you go. That's right here. If you go to this Lua tab and look at this, this is the Lua that's being generated by our block controller so far. We've got about 55 lines of code. That's being managed automatically. That's code we didn't have to write. It exists already. And if I scroll down, you can see what we've already written. We've got a controls nav1 room event handler that is starting a function, and that function is all of these comment blocks that we just made. Dash dash, that's a comment in Lua. When the nav1 button is pressed, dash dash, nav1 UCI layer should appear, etc. It's writing the code for us, and it wrote that in that order because they were connected to each other. You may find there are times where if your blocks are not connected to each other, like if this one's just floating around out here, the block controller will probably do its best job of assuming what order you want it in, but there may be times where you need to force it to be in the correct order, or else it's not going to execute something properly. So as you build these in this kind of free-form space, keep that in mind. You may need to make sure they execute by snapping them together to make sure they're in the right order, because sometimes that's the thing. All right, so we've got our event handler. on control nav1 room change. That means when the button is pressed, it's going to do a bunch of things. And this is the list of things that it's going to do. What do we want it to do? Well, first thing is nav1 UCI layer should appear. Let's grab that block. That is in the system branch. It's this one right here. In particular UCI, we're going to hide or show a particular layer. Drag that out, snap it right here, make some room for myself. And let's make sure we're choosing the right choices. Right now, by default, it's going to pick probably the first UCI in the system. We don't want that one. Let's change this to be our class UCI. Which page? The main page. We want to show layer 100 room. That's correct. And then whatever transition style you want. I like mine to fade, so I'm going to keep it on fade. OK. So far, so good. By the way, you may have noticed already, anytime you make any change of any kind, you get this big button at the top that says Save Changes. Your script does not execute until you hit Save Changes. That's useful because that means that if you're editing your script on a design that's running, the old version of the script will continue to run even while you completely destroy it and cobble it back together. Nothing will be pushed live until you hit Save Changes. All right, we've turned on the layer that we want to see. Let's turn off the layers that we don't want to see. I'm going to click this block and duplicate it by right-clicking and duplicating rather than going and grabbing it out of the side again. I'll snap that down here. By the way, you notice that even though it's kind of hard to pull a block out of a sequence of blocks, you can snap one in really easily just by inserting it. So we want layers 2 and 3 to disappear. OK, so on the class UCI main page, we're going to hide layer 200, and I'll keep it with the transition of fade. We'll duplicate that again, snap it in again. We're going to hide layer 300, and we're going to keep the transition of fade. Now, I actually want to go a little bit further on this. I'm going to do this one more time, and I'm going to snap it right here, and I'm going to show layer 999. Why am I doing that? Well, if I have this button being pressed that is going to move me to a particular page on my UCI, I want everything about the UCI to be set in a correct state. It's probably unlikely that there's anything in this design that's going to ever turn off my 999 base layer. I don't think I'm ever going to make that even a possibility. But does it hurt me to cover my bases? No, it doesn't. I might as well. I might as well just add this in here to make sure that that layer is on. You never know. You could be editing your design, and you're playing in the UCI editor window, and you're turning off different layers as you're adding different controls. This assures me that when the system boots up and we go to that page, everything is reset and set to a good, healthy starting point. I like that. So good layer on. All the other layers, we're just adjusting all the other layers. That's nice. And now we're going to change the navigation buttons. We can do that by going to the controls themselves. I want to go to the nav1, nav2, and nav3 options. We want to turn off buttons 2 and 3, right? I can go to nav2 displays, and I'm going to say I want to set the controls Boolean. Set nav2 displays Boolean. Boolean is essentially a way of saying it's truthiness. I'm going to steal that. It's truthiness. Whether it is in a state of being true or whether it is in a state of being false. It can either be on or off. It is either on or off. And we're going to just grab this one and say, yes, we want its Boolean state to be false. We'll duplicate that again and say nav3 button should also be false. I'm going to do the same thing, though, here. And I'm also going to reinforce the state of button 1. So I'm going to duplicate this and actually make it the first one so that they're always in order, 1, 2, 3. We're going to make sure that button 1 is set to true. Now, why would I do that? Do I need to do that? If you hit the button, of course it's on. Why do I need to turn the button on when you turn the button on? Well, for these particular controls, think about the fact that if it's on and you press that button again, what do you want to have happen? Do you want the button to be able to be turned off? No. No, that doesn't even make any sense. Think about those radio buttons in your Volvo. You can't unpress the radio station. You have to press some other radio station, right? You can't deactivate it. What would that even mean? Where would it go if you deactivated it? No one does that. You want the same behavior to be true if it's on or if someone accidentally hits it again. So in this case, all of these things will be true whether someone is turning it on or whether someone is turning it off. because we don't want them to be able to turn it off. That's not how this functionality works. It's just not in our list of things that should happen, which is actually really nice because that means that we don't need to write an if-else statement for this at all. We're going to deal with if-elses throughout the rest of this course. We don't need one here because all of this should happen every time someone presses this button in any state whatsoever. All right. Last thing I want to do in this particular event handler is I want to add some feedback to ourselves about what just happened. So we're going to go to the system block. We're going to grab this top one, debug print, and bring this all the way at the bottom. The debug print is going to give us some information here in the debug window. Where's the debug window, you ask? It only shows up when you are emulating. So let's go to File, Emulate, and let's take a look at the bottom half of our screen. We now have some feedback information within the block controller of what it's doing. When it started, it gives us a timestamp of it starting the script. Glorious. And then anything that we tell the system to debug print will show up here in our debug output. So in this one, here we have a ghost block, our half visible blue block here. I'm going to go ahead and replace that with an actual string. It's the same functionality, but I just don't like ghosts hanging around. Call me crazy. You never know. They might slime you. I'm going to type in here, UCI is set to room. That's information about what happened, right? The button was pressed. The UCI is now displaying the Rooms tab. I think that's going to work out for me rather nicely. And I will save my changes. Once again, starting the script. If I go over to my class UCI and I click the Rooms navigation button, well, so far it seems like it's working. The other two buttons are off. The room controls layer appears to be on. If I go back to my block controller, here's my debug print that says UCI is set to room. Lovely. If I went back to my UCI, the other two buttons we haven't written any event handlers yet for. So I press them. They're turning on. We don't have that interlocking built yet. We need to add that. But if I click on my room button again, it works. It turns the other ones off, and my layers are set appropriately. So the button is working how we want it to. That's great. Let's duplicate this for our other two buttons. I could go and grab all of these controls one by one again from where they came from and snap them in and make the adjustments. I don't need to do that. When you duplicate a block, it will also duplicate everything that is within that block. And our nice large event handler here is just that. I can right-click, duplicate it, and I'll just scroll on down and place this below. But oh no, what's happened? It's all broken. What's going on? Why is everything shaded out and got this weird crisscross in front of it? This is no longer functional. My system is broken. Why did I do that? What's going on here is that the block controller will only allow you to have one event handler for any particular control. You can't give it two different competing lists of instructions to follow. You've got to have one list of instructions, and everything you want to have happen must be within that one event handler, no matter how complicated that might end up being. Right now, when we duplicated this, we've got another event handler that says onControl nav1 room change. It's got two lists. It's telling us this is no good. We got to fix it. So I'm going to say no, not onControl nav1 room change. The second one will be when nav2 display changes. And now we can see it all fixed itself, right? This top one's healthy again, bottom one's healthy again. Let's just update all the things in this event handler that are specific to nav2 rather than nav1. I'll update my comments. It should be when nav2 button is pressed. Then nav2 UCI layer should appear, which means that we are going to hide layer 100, and we're going to show number 200. In fact, at this point, I'm going to kind of collapse these comments into one thing, so that I'm just going to say layers should adjust appropriately. Make this a little bit easier for myself to read. And that way I've got one block of 4 UCI layers that remain alphanumerically the way they showed up in my UCI editor window, right? 100, 200, 300, 900. So I'm hiding the first one, showing the second one, hiding 300, still going to show 900, perfect. And the navigation buttons should turn on or off appropriately. So I'm going to say nav1 should be false, nav2 should be true, and we'll adjust our debug to say UCI is set to displays. All right. You can probably figure out how to do the third one now. Maybe you can beat me to it. I'm going to duplicate this again, scroll on down to the bottom, and I'm going to adjust everything for our third button. This is going to be for nav3. When nav3 is pressed, then we're going to hide the first 2 layers, show the third layer, still keep 999 on. Nav2 will be false, nav3 will be true. My debug will be set, in this case, to cameras. All right, that is functional. If we go and look at our UCI now, I go to displays, voila. You saw the fading action, right, in the top header. The other button's turned off. I go to cameras, it fades to cameras control. Room, displays, they all are interactive, they're interlocking. This is exactly what we wanted. Did it take us 30 minutes? Maybe. Like I said, could you have done this with a selector or a router? Sure. But as you'll see soon, we're going to start to make this much more interesting. Before we do that, I want to mention one thing. This is an interesting talking point I want to mention. So when we set this event handler to occur, right? When I press nav3 button, in the course of what nav3 button does, down here at the bottom, what it does is it changes nav1 room and nav2 room, right? Well, wait a second. Didn't we just say that when nav1 changes, it's going to set everything to the rooms layer and turn off the other buttons? And when nav2 is pressed, isn't it going to do the same thing? Isn't the very act of running through all of these commands going to re-trigger the other event handlers and make them do that, which will then re-trigger the event handlers again and create an infinite loop of them triggering each other? No, it doesn't. It's smarter than that, fortunately. Event handlers only react to outside stimuli. It reacts to a finger pressing it on a UCI. It reacts to an impulse coming into the block controller. It will react to that, but it doesn't react to the script that's inside of the block controller itself. So when you trigger a control internally, it is smart enough to know that that is not an event, right? And if it's not an event, then there's nothing we need to do to run the event handler. It's simply a change of states. The event handler, when it runs, it could change the state of the button, but the event handler isn't itself the state, right? So when something else triggers it, it's kind of bypassing the event handler to change the state on its own without making a new event along the way. Very, very important. There will be times, boy, when you're writing a script and you're thinking to yourself, this should be working the way I want it to, and it might not be working the way you want it to because you're relying on an event handler to be triggering that is not being triggered because you're doing it internally. And there's always ways to work around that. You could recall the function in a different way, or you could send a control out of your block controller to come back in via another pin. We'll get into that later, maybe. Just wanted to explain that and reinforce that event handlers only react to external stimuli, not to internal stimuli. Sound good? All right. We've got our interlocking buttons. They're lovely. They work. And this is all terrible. It's terrible. Everything we just wrote is terrible. It's not the right way to do it. I showed you this way to do it because I wanted you to do it the slow, monotonous way first before we build it in a better way. But what we just did is not something I would ever do in the real world, and I'll tell you why. In the next section, we're going to do it better. So take a break, we'll come back, and we're going to revise these buttons in a smarter way.